Hello, and welcome back to Emovura Audiobooks. Thank you for choosing to spend this next hour with us. A quick note before we start. Tonight's story is a work of fiction. Every name, every place, every event has been invented for the purposes of storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This one deals with themes of mental illness and violence. If you enjoy this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Tonight's story is called The Levin Stop, and it's about twin sisters, an inseparable bond that curdles into something nobody can quite explain, and one very ordinary night that ends in a way nobody could have predicted. Part 1. Two Girls from Golden Bay. Not much is known about the childhoods of Elsa and Vera Nordahl, and what little is known comes mostly from the hazy, half-remembered accounts of people who crossed paths with them decades ago and never expected to be asked about it again. They were born in Golden Bay, right at the top of the South Island, on a wet Tuesday in July. Twins, the second and third of 4 children in a family that mostly kept to itself, tucked away on a small property not far from the coast. If you'd grown up in that part of the world back then, you'd know the kind of childhood it probably was. Barefoot summers, long silences, a closeness to the land and the sea that either grounds a person for life or leaves them feeling like they were always meant to be somewhere else. Teachers who remembered the Nordahl twins at all, and there weren't many, because the girls left school young and slipped out of most people's memories not long after, described them as intense, private, the kind of children who spoke more to each other than to anyone else in the room, who occasionally got into playground scraps that seemed to erupt out of nowhere and burn far hotter than the situation called for. Neither girl was ever formally treated for a mental illness. But more than one teacher, asked about it years later, would pause for a long moment before answering, and then say something like, "There was always just something. Something you couldn't quite put your finger on." Their years after school are harder to trace than perhaps they should be, for two people who would one day become the center of a story like this one. By their early 30s, both sisters had scattered a long way from Golden Bay. Vera ended up in Perth, working a string of retail jobs, rarely coming home, rarely even calling. Elsa stayed closer, relatively speaking, settling in the small coastal settlement of Mapua, in the Tasman district, just across the water from Nelson. She built something that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life. A partner, 2 young children, a weatherboard house with a garden that mostly grew whatever it wanted to. There's a strange detail buried in the years before all this happened, one that nobody in the family has ever properly explained. For a period of time, Elsa's young son went to live with his Aunt Vera in Australia. Nobody knows exactly why. Nobody knows for how long precisely, or what prompted it, or what prompted his eventual return. It's one of those loose threads that never gets tied off in a story like this. You just have to sit with it the way the people who lived through it apparently had to. Then, in the autumn of a year now more than a decade behind us, it was Vera's turn to make the trip. She flew from Perth to Nelson to stay with her sister, and by every single account from people who saw them together that week, the 2 women fell straight back into an intensity that startled even those who already knew how close they'd always been. Inseparable. Finishing each other's sentences before the words were fully out. Rarely more than a single room apart, even inside a house that had plenty of them. And then, at around 2 in the morning on a Friday, Elsa and Vera Nordahl walked out of that house in Mapua without telling a single soul where they were going. What we know, and what we don't. Before we go further, I think it's worth being honest with you about something. This is not a story with all the gaps filled in. A lot of what follows comes from fragments, police statements, court records, the recollections of people who crossed paths with the Nordahl sisters for a single evening and never saw them again. Elsa's partner, when later asked to describe the argument that apparently sent her out the door at 2 in the morning, struggled to characterize it as anything more than ordinary. A disagreement about money, he thought. Or maybe about Vera's visit overstaying its welcome, though he was quick to say the two sisters had seemed nothing but delighted to be reunited. He couldn't point to a single moment that, in hindsight, seemed to foreshadow anything at all. That's often how it goes with stories like this one. We want a clean thread we can follow backward from the worst moment to the first warning sign. Sometimes that thread exists, and sometimes, infuriatingly, it just doesn't. There's only an ordinary Thursday evening, an ordinary disagreement, and then, a few hours later, something has changed so fundamentally that the people who loved these two women most were left with nothing but questions for the rest of their lives.
Part 2.
A long way to ask a question. They weren't seen again until 8:30 the following morning in Wellington, on the other side of the Cook Strait. Having apparently caught the very first inter-island sailing out of Picton, hours earlier, in the pitch dark. Think about that for a second. Somewhere close to 4 hours by ferry and car, in the middle of the night, without a word to anyone. Two women who, as far as anybody could tell, had no plan, no luggage beyond what they could carry, and no explanation they were willing to offer. They walked into a central Wellington police station, and Elsa told the officer at the desk that she was worried, deeply worried, about the safety of her children. Her children, who were, at that exact moment, still asleep in their beds back in Mapua, roughly a 4-hour ferry crossing and a long drive away. Why travel all the way to Wellington to raise a concern like that? Why not simply pick up a phone? Nobody has ever been able to answer that question. Not the police who took the report that morning. Not the family in the years since. Not even Elsa herself, who, as we'll get to, chose, for the rest of this story, to explain almost nothing at all. Wellington police did what you'd expect. They rang their counterparts in Nelson, who drove out to the Mapua address and knocked on the door. Elsa's partner answered. The children were fine, asleep, unaware anything was even happening. The partner told police that Elsa had left suddenly, in the small hours, after an argument between the two of them. He had no idea she'd gone all the way to Wellington. He had, if we're honest, no idea what to make of any of it. Police told the sisters they could always call again if their concerns continued. And with that, Elsa and Vera Nordahl walked back out of the police station together into a Wellington morning with absolutely nowhere they needed to be. Part 3. The coach to nowhere. What they did next was board an inner-city coach. It left Wellington's central bus terminal a little before 11:30 that morning, bound for Auckland, a journey of the better part of a day, winding up through the lower North Island before eventually reaching the top. Elsa and Vera climbed aboard together, each carrying a single bag. And here's the first small detail that, on its own, means almost nothing, and yet, looking back, means almost everything. Both women refused to let the driver store their bags in the coach's luggage hold. They kept them instead on their laps, for the entire journey, holding on as though letting go for even a moment wasn't an option. I want you to sit in that seat with them for a second. Picture the hum of the engine, the low murmur of other passengers around you, headphones in, half asleep, completely unaware that anything is wrong. And two sisters, side by side, arms wrapped around bags they won't let out of their sight, murmuring to each other in tones too low for anyone nearby to catch. Just after 1 o'clock, the coach pulled off State Highway 1 and into the Waidohu Service Center, a truck stop and cafe on the highway a little south of Levin. It wasn't a scheduled rest stop, not on this particular route, not at this particular time. Exactly why the driver stopped there has never been entirely clear. Some who've looked into it since believe it was simply a driver changeover. Others believe the driver had simply had enough of two passengers whose behavior was making the rest of the coach visibly uncomfortable. Whatever the reason, when the coach pulled back onto the highway a little while later, Elsa and Vera Nordahl were not on it. Part 4. Renee watches the forecourt. The driver had refused to let them back on board after they wouldn't allow him to look through their bags. Before he pulled away, he had a quiet word with a service center employee, a woman named Renee, and asked her if she didn't mind to keep half an eye on the two of them. Renee did more than half an eye's worth of watching. From behind the counter, she found herself unable to look away as Elsa and Vera paced slow loops around the forecourt, bags clutched to their chests like something precious or something dangerous. It was genuinely hard to tell which. They spoke to each other constantly, heads bent close together, in a way that Renee would later describe as looking less like a conversation and more like plotting. That was the word she used. Plotting. It unsettled her enough that she picked up the phone and called the police herself, worried, not unreasonably, given how tense the two women looked, that whatever was in those bags might not be entirely innocent. Officers arrived within the hour. They searched both bags thoroughly. They found nothing, no weapons, no contraband, nothing more alarming than the ordinary contents of 2 traveling bags. The officers handed Elsa and Vera a card with the bus operator's booking line printed on it, suggesting they call ahead and reserve 2 seats on whichever service came through next toward Auckland, and by every account the 2 women seemed to accept this arrangement calmly enough. But by the time the next coach rolled into the Waidohu Service Center, Elsa and Vera were nowhere to be found. They hadn't waited. Instead of standing at a bus stop like anyone else in their position might, the 2 sisters had walked out of the service center, crossed onto State Highway 1 itself, and started walking north. Not along the footpath, not along the shoulder, onto the road. Renee later. I want to tell you a little more about Renee, the service center worker who watched Elsa and Vera pace the forecourt that afternoon, because her account of those minutes has always stuck with me more than almost any other detail in this story. Renee had worked at the Waidohu Service Center for 6 years by that point. She'd seen every kind of traveler pass through. Truck drivers running on no sleep and too much coffee, families mid-meltdown on long car trips, backpackers counting out coins for a pie. She prided herself, she said later, on being hard to rattle. The Nordahl twins rattled her. It wasn't anything either woman said to her directly. In fact, neither of them spoke to Renee at all, beyond the driver's brief, tense exchange before he pulled away. It was the quality of their silence with each other that unsettled her. The way they moved in a kind of unconscious unison, turning at the same moment, stopping at the same moment, as though operating from a single shared instinct rather than 2 separate minds. Renee described it, in her statement, as being like watching someone argue with their own reflection, except the reflection kept agreeing. She has said since that she wishes she'd done more than make a phone call. Though it's hard to imagine, honestly, what more there was for her to do. She saw something wrong, and she raised the alarm. Officers came, searched the bags, found nothing, and did exactly what they were trained to do in a situation with no clear evidence of any crime. Nobody failed that afternoon. Sometimes that's simply how these stories go. Every single person does the reasonable thing, one after another, and it still isn't enough. Renee still works at that same service center today, more than a decade on. She said she thinks about the twins every single time a certain kind of customer walks in. She couldn't quite explain what kind, just something about the way 2 people move together, a particular quality of closeness between them, that brings the whole afternoon rushing back. She doesn't call the police anymore when it happens. She just watches a little longer than she used to and hopes, quietly, that she's wrong.
Part 5.
Onto the road. The stretch of highway running past Levin is covered by a network of traffic cameras, monitored from a regional operations center that keeps an eye on incidents and congestion across the wider region. At around 20 past 3 that afternoon, an operator watching the live feed noticed two women walking steadily along the grass median strip between the north and southbound lanes of State Highway 1. It is, by any measure, a genuinely dangerous place to be on foot. The median offers almost no protection, just a low guardrail on either side, cars and trucks streaming past at highway speed only meters away. A highway patrol car was dispatched immediately to move the two women somewhere safer. And this is where things turn, suddenly and violently, in a direction nobody watching could have predicted. The moment the patrol car pulled up nearby, something in the sisters seemed to break loose all at once. Without warning, without a word between them that anyone caught, Elsa and Vera bolted from the median directly into the lanes of oncoming traffic. Cars swerved. Brakes screamed against the tarmac. One driver, closing too fast to stop in time, clipped Vera and sent her sprawling across the road. And then, almost unbelievably, she got straight back up, seemingly unhurt. The two sisters made their way to the shoulder of the highway, where officers and, soon after, paramedics began converging on what looked, for one brief and deceptive moment, like a situation that had already resolved itself. Among the officers who arrived were Constable Hannah Ropata and Constable Liam Foster, and in one of those strange coincidences that seem to turn up in true stories far more often than fiction would ever dare invent, the pair happened to have a small television crew riding along with them that particular shift, filming for a fly-on-the-wall documentary series about road policing in New Zealand. Footage that, out of respect for the people involved, would ultimately never see the light of day. By the time the crew's cameras were rolling on the shoulder of State Highway 1, the scene in front of them looked almost mundane. Elsa and Vera stood beside two highway patrol officers who'd arrived moments earlier. Everybody was talking. Everybody seemed calm. Paramedics hadn't arrived yet, and looking at it from a distance, you'd have struggled to guess that anything serious had happened at all. Then, with no warning whatsoever, Vera lunged toward the road. The officer standing beside her grabbed for her jacket. He caught only fabric. She wrenched herself free of it entirely and sprinted directly into the path of an oncoming heavy transport truck. The truck driver had no time to stop. It struck her at speed, and it passed clean over the top of her. Elsa moved next. She sprinted across to the opposite lanes and hurled herself, without a flicker of hesitation, directly in front of an approaching car. The impact threw her up over the bonnet, cracked the windscreen where she struck it, and flung her back down onto the road surface, where she lay completely still. Both women were alive. Barely. For a moment, everyone on that stretch of highway simply stood frozen. Constable Foster would later describe it as one of those strange gaps in time that trauma seems to carve out for itself. The noise of the impact still ringing in the air, drivers up and down both carriageways slamming on brakes in a chain reaction stretching back hundreds of meters, and then, for just a second or two, an almost total silence, as if the highway itself were holding its breath before anyone could move. Then everyone moved at once. Part 6. Chaos on the Shoulder. What followed, according to every single officer who was there that afternoon, was one of the strangest and most harrowing scenes any of them had ever attended in years of careers that had already shown them plenty. The highway was shut down in both directions within minutes. Officers rushed to render what aid they could while a call went out for urgent paramedic and helicopter support. Constable Foster reached Vera first. Her legs were catastrophically injured, compound fractures, visible through torn denim, the kind of injury that should have left her in shock, barely conscious. Instead, as he knelt beside her trying to keep her still, trying to stop her from moving and making things worse, she began screaming for the police. He was a police officer. He was kneeling directly over her. She didn't seem to register that at all. She grew combative almost instantly spitting, clawing at him, fighting with a strength that Constable Foster, a man built like a front-row prop by his own colleague's description, would later say felt almost impossible to reconcile with the state of her shattered legs. Meanwhile, Constable Ropata had stayed with Elsa, who seemed, for a few moments, strangely calm. And then, without warning, she wasn't. She sat bolt upright, shouted something about people trying to steal her organs, shoved the officer hard enough to knock her back a step, and bolted across the median toward the southbound lanes, narrowly avoiding being struck a second time by traffic that hadn't yet fully stopped. Officers gave chase on foot. When Constable Ropata finally caught up with her, Elsa tore off her own jacket and squared up as if preparing to fight, screaming for the police, again, even as she stood surrounded by them. It took 6 people, in the end, to bring her under control. Even restrained, she kept fighting, kicking, twisting, straining against people twice her size with what more than one officer that day called an almost inhuman strength. Paramedics were ultimately forced to sedate her on the roadside before they could even begin to treat the injuries from being struck by a moving vehicle less than 10 minutes earlier. Nobody on that stretch of highway that afternoon, not the officers, not the paramedics, not the small camera crew quietly capturing all of it, had ever seen anything quite like it. The working theory in those first chaotic minutes was drugs. Somebody murmured the word packed. Nobody had a better explanation. The documentary crew's footage, though it was ultimately never broadcast, was retained and later reviewed by investigators as part of the file. Constable Ropata has said, in the years since, that she has watched those minutes back more times than she'd like to admit. Not out of any morbid fascination, but because she kept hoping that on some rewatch, some details she'd missed the first 10 times would finally make sense of it. It never has. You want it to look like something, she said. A signal. A moment where you could point and say, that's when it turned. But it just looks like 2 women standing on a road, and then it doesn't. A search of the sisters' bags turned up several mobile phones and a single passport belonging to Vera. There was no identification at all for Elsa. Both women were rushed to hospital. Vera arrived in critical condition. Elsa's injuries, almost unbelievably given what had just happened to her, were assessed as minor. Given the severity of her injuries, doctors ran a full toxicology screen on Vera. It came back completely clean. No drugs. No alcohol. Elsa's blood was never tested. Her injuries didn't meet the threshold, and at that point she wasn't yet facing any serious charge. The working assumption, reasonable enough at the time, was that if her sister hadn't taken anything, she probably hadn't either. Before her discharge, Elsa was examined by a duty doctor, assessed separately by an on-call psychiatrist, and interviewed by a social worker from the hospital's crisis team. All 3 independently found nothing wrong with her. She was released from hospital just 5 hours after running headlong into oncoming motorway traffic. I want you to hold on to that detail. We're going to come back to it. Part 7. And Evening in Levin. Once discharged, Elsa was taken straight into police custody and charged with trespassing on a state highway and assaulting an officer. The woman who had thrown herself in front of a moving car and fought off 6 grown adults was, by the time she reached the station, eerily composed. So relaxed, in fact, that officers didn't even bother handcuffing her for the short drive. She appeared before the Levin District Court 2 days later and pleaded guilty to both charges. Having effectively already served the equivalent of her sentence while in custody, she was released that same afternoon. Throughout the entire process, Elsa seemed almost untouched by what had happened. She chatted easily with court staff. She cracked the odd joke. And at one point, in the middle of all that eerie calm, she said something that would come to seem chilling in hindsight, the kind of line you only really notice once you know what's coming. Where I grew up, she told one of the staff, almost conversationally. "We always say an accident rarely travels alone. There's usually at least one more right behind it." That evening, a 54-year-old man named Peter Ahern was walking home from the pub with his friend Tama Wiremoo and Peter's dog, cutting along a quiet residential street not far from the courthouse where Elsa had been released only hours earlier. The two men noticed a woman standing across the road, clutching a plastic bag of belongings, looking lost and visibly distressed. It was Elsa. She called out that Peter's dog looked friendly. It was enough of an opening that the two men crossed over to talk to her. She explained that her sister was in hospital, that she was trying to find her, that she needed somewhere to stay for the night. Peter, a man everyone who knew him would later describe, without exception, as endlessly generous, the sort of person who simply couldn't walk past somebody who needed help, offered to have her over, feed her, help her sort out somewhere proper to stay in the morning. It was exactly the kind of thing Peter Ahern always did. Part 8. What happened at Peter's house? Elsa accepted, and the three of them walked back to Peter's house together, where the two men poured a couple of beers and settled in for the evening. But every time the conversation drifted toward her sister, Elsa's mood shifted. She'd change the subject abruptly, or fall into an uneasy silence that neither man knew quite how to fill. Several times over the course of the evening, she got up without explanation, walked to the window, pulled back the curtain, and stared up and down the empty street for a long moment before letting it fall and sitting back down, as though checking for someone, as though certain someone was out there, watching the house. At one point, she offered the two men cigarettes from her own packet. As they went to light them, she suddenly snatched the packet back. "They might be poisoned," she said. "You can't have them." She had, of course, been smoking from that exact packet all night. Tama's unease deepened by the minute. He made his excuses and left not long after, unable to shake the feeling, one he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, that something in that room was very wrong. Peter, characteristically relaxed about the whole thing, told him not to worry. Elsa was just a bit eccentric, he said. Nothing to be concerned about. What struck people afterward, turning the evening over and over in the weeks and months that followed, was one detail in particular. A woman who had been struck by a moving car hard enough to be thrown into the air, barely 48 hours earlier, showed no sign whatsoever of being in any physical pain at all. The following afternoon, Peter put a call through to his brother, a nurse on shift at the local hospital, hoping for any word on how Vera was doing. He sounded entirely like himself on the call, cheerful, easygoing, unhurried, and at one point his brother could hear Elsa's voice somewhere in the background, apparently at ease. At around 20 to 8 that evening, Peter wandered outside and called over to his neighbor Frank to see if he could spare a splash of milk. Frank, elbow deep in washing his car, said he'd drop some round once he'd rinsed off. Peter thanked him and headed back inside. 1 minute later, he staggered back out through the front door. He was bleeding heavily from 4 separate stab wounds, one of them to the heart. "I've been stabbed," he managed to say. "She stabbed me." Then he collapsed onto the ground. Frank called emergency services immediately. In the final moments before he lost consciousness, Peter asked him to look after his dog. He didn't survive. Frank has talked, in the years since, about how ordinary that entire exchange felt right up until the moment it wasn't. Lending a neighbor a splash of milk is about as unremarkable an interaction as exists on a suburban street, the kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day in 1,000 different towns, and means nothing at all, until the one time it turns out to be the last conversation you'll ever have with someone. Frank kept Peter's dog, as asked. He has it still. He has also said that in the weeks after, he found himself replaying the sound of Peter's voice calling out to him, not the desperate, bleeding version from that final minute, but the earlier one, easy and unbothered, asking after a bit of milk like it was any other Tuesday. He said it took him a long time to be able to remember that earlier voice without the later one crashing in right behind it. Meanwhile, Elsa bolted from the house and tore up the street with a hammer gripped tight in one hand, bringing it down against her own skull over and over as she ran. A passing motorist named Josh Karima spotted her, hair matted dark with blood, more of it soaked down the front of her jacket, and pulled over, grabbing for the hammer in an attempt to wrestle it free. She turned on him violently instead, striking him with a broken piece of roof tile pulled from her pocket, then sprinted off again. She ran until she reached a footbridge crossing a stretch of the Ohio River. She climbed the railing, and she jumped. The fall broke both her ankles and fractured her skull.
She survived.
Part 9. What the evidence showed. Police searching Peter Ahern's house found Elsa's DNA on the kitchen knife used to kill him. The blood soaked into her jacket. The jacket she'd been wearing when she jumped from the bridge matched Peter's exactly. She remained in hospital for nearly 4 months before being discharged in a wheelchair and formally charged with murder. Vera, discharged that same month, faced no charges at all and returned to Australia not long afterward. Throughout the entire investigation, Elsa refused to answer a single question about what had happened inside that house. She offered detectives nothing. Not denial, not explanation, not even the small, self-serving lies that so many people in her position reach for instinctively. Just silence. She initially pleaded not guilty, and a trial date was set, though it was later delayed by difficulties obtaining her full medical history. Ahead of the eventual trial, 2 forensic psychiatrists, one instructed by the defense, one by the Crown, separately assessed her. Both, independently, reached the same broad conclusion, that at the moment she killed Peter Ahern, Elsa Nordahl had been experiencing a genuine and severe episode of mental illness. Where they disagreed was on exactly what to call it. The defense's expert diagnosed something rare, a condition in which delusional beliefs become shared between 2 people bound by an unusually close relationship. In Elsa's case, that relationship was, of course, her bond with her twin sister. The theory went that when Vera ran toward the truck, some part of Elsa followed her into that same break from reality and never fully returned. Giving evidence, the defense psychiatrist explained it to the court in terms anyone could follow. In these rare cases, she said, one person in the pair is typically the more dominant personality, the primary source of the delusion. The second person doesn't develop the belief independently. They absorb it, almost like a kind of psychological contagion, because the bond between them is so profound that separating one mind's reality from the other's becomes genuinely difficult. It is vanishingly rare. It is also, in my professional opinion, entirely consistent with everything we know about how these 2 women related to each other their whole lives. The Crown's expert took a different view. A brief, acute psychotic episode, the kind that can arrive without warning, burn hot and violent for a period of hours or days, and then disappear almost as suddenly as it came, leaving barely a trace behind by the time a doctor gets a chance to examine the person afterward. Under cross-examination, he conceded that he could not point to any specific triggering event in the 24 hours before the twins left Mapua, and agreed, somewhat reluctantly, that this made his own diagnosis difficult to prove with total certainty. Psychiatry, he told the court, is not always a science of certainties. Sometimes it is a science of the best available explanation for something that defies easy explanation altogether. On the strength of these findings, Elsa pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. The judge accepted the plea, noting that whichever diagnosis was correct, both experts agreed on the essential point, that a genuine and, by all appearances, temporary form of mental illness had been present. Because Elsa appeared to have made a full recovery by the time of sentencing, She couldn't be detained in a secure psychiatric facility. Neither side argued she posed an ongoing risk to the public. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In handing down that sentence, the judge addressed the courtroom directly. "I want to be clear," she said, "that this sentence reflects my assessment of culpability, given the severity of the mental illness involved at the time. It is not, and it cannot be, any kind of measure of the value of Mr. Ahern's life. No sentence I hand down today could ever do that." The sentencing hearing itself ran for the better part of a day. Talma Wiremu, the friend who had spent that final uneasy evening with Peter and Elsa before leaving early, gave a statement to the court describing the guilt he had carried ever since, the sense, however irrational, that if he'd stayed, if he'd said something more forcefully to Peter about how wrong the whole evening had felt, things might have gone differently. The judge, in her remarks, gently but firmly told him that no reasonable person in his position could have predicted what followed, and that the responsibility for that night rested nowhere else but with the illness that had taken hold of the woman across the road. Peter's mother, elderly and supported into the courtroom by 2 of her other children, did not read a statement herself, but asked that a short one be read on her behalf. It was brief. Peter was the kind of boy who brought home every stray animal and every lost person he ever met, it read. It never occurred to him that kindness could be dangerous. "I don't want that to change how anyone remembers him. I want people to keep helping strangers. I just wish, this once, it hadn't cost him everything." There was, by all accounts, no visible reaction from Elsa as the statement was read. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking somewhere just past the judge's shoulder, the same distant expression she'd worn, witnesses said, through nearly every day of the proceedings. Vera's silence. We haven't spoken much about Vera in all of this, and I think that's worth correcting before we move on, because her side of the story is, in its own way, just as unresolved as her sister's. Vera spent close to 4 months in hospital rebuilding a body that had been struck by a 40-ton truck at highway speed. She underwent multiple surgeries on both legs and endured a recovery that doctors described, cautiously, as remarkable given the severity of the initial injuries. She was, by every clinical measure, lucky to be alive at all. She was never charged with any offense connected to that afternoon on State Highway 1. There was, prosecutors concluded, no evidence she had done anything beyond running into traffic in what appeared to be the same psychological state that had briefly overtaken her sister, a state that, whatever it was, seemed to pass through Vera and never return, at least not in any way that led to further violence. She returned to Perth not long after her discharge and has, in the years since, declined every single request for an interview. A journalist who tracked her down some years later for a magazine feature on the case reported that Vera answered the door, listened politely to the request, and said only, "There's nothing I could tell you that would make any of it make sense. I don't understand it either." Then she closed the door, gently, and that was the end of the conversation. It's a strange kind of silence to sit with, as someone telling the story. 2 sisters, so close that people around them struggled to describe where one ended and the other began, and neither one of them, in all the years since, has ever offered so much as a single sentence of explanation for any of it. Part 10. After. Peter Ahern's brother, Michael, has spoken publicly in the years since, not to condemn Elsa herself, but to question a system that released a woman from hospital only 5 hours after she had run screaming into live motorway traffic, fought off 6 adults, and shown, in the words of 3 separate medical professionals, no sign of anything wrong at all. "Somebody should have looked closer," Michael has said. "My brother saw a woman standing on her own, looking lost, and he did what he always did. He tried to help her. That's who he was. If he saw someone losing a fight on the street, he'd wade in and help them too. He just couldn't walk past somebody who needed a hand. Peter's death prompted a quiet but persistent conversation in the years that followed among mental health professionals and police alike about the gap between a hospital discharge and what actually happens to a person afterward, especially someone who has just lived through something as violent and disorienting as being struck by a car on a state highway. 3 separate professionals examined Elsa that day and found nothing wrong. All 3 were, in a narrow clinical sense, doing their jobs correctly. And yet a man was dead within 24 hours of that assessment. It's the kind of contradiction that doesn't resolve itself no matter how many times you turn it over, and it's one that Michael Ahern has said he still turns over most nights, more than a decade on. Elsa never spoke publicly about what happened inside that house, maintaining her silence right through to the end of the court process and, as far as anyone knows, every day since. Nobody has ever explained why the sisters left Mapua in the middle of that night. Nobody has explained the ferry crossing, the police station, the coach that went nowhere, the bags that were never let out of anyone's arms. Like her sister before her, Elsa eventually returned to Australia after completing her sentence, and, just as in the years before any of this happened, very little is known about what became of her life after. Some stories end with an answer. This one, I think, mostly ends with a question, one that Peter Ahern's family has had to learn to live alongside, whether they ever wanted to or not. What actually happened in that house between 2 sisters and a stranger who is only ever trying to help? We may never fully know. This has been the Levin Stop, a work of fiction, drawing loosely on the kind of strange, unsettling cases that occasionally surface in the true crime world, but with every name, every place, and every specific detail reimagined for tonight's telling. And that's where we'll leave tonight's story, here on Emovura Audiobooks. I know this one sat a little heavier than some. Stories about the mind breaking down in ways nobody can quite explain always do. I think there's no tidy villain to point to, no clean lesson to take away. Just people doing something none of us can fully understand, and the people left behind trying to make sense of it anyway. Until next time, this has been Emovura Audiobooks. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you in the next story.